Tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Success in circuit lies. Too bright for our infirm delight, the truth's superb surprise. As lightning to the children eased, with explanation kind, the truth must dazzle gradually, or every man be blind. Emily Dickinson. Can we jettison the autobiography of the artist, when that autobiography already exists and has been exploited in the world, especially the art world, which hinges its markets and its commodity fetishism around such things as autobiography, especially autobiographies that have a traumatic kernel, ones that reach back into childhood and are continued on into adulthood and sublimated through a medium like painting. I'm referring here to the artist Mohammed Sami, currently exhibiting at Douglas Hyde Gallery Dublin, and his very explicit relationship with autobiography and the way in which he expresses or rejects that autobiography, explicitly or not, consciously or not, in his paintings. And whether this explicitness and consciousness and rejection of autobiography in the battle for realism is the central question when we look and experience, emphasis on experience, the paintings of Mohammed Sami. Mohammed Sami paintings are not Brian Maguire paintings, the latter painter explicitly colonizing trauma from other geographies where trauma has been inflicted by authoritarian governments. Mohammed Sami is not a colonizer of trauma. His trauma comes from a lived experience, one that, in some ways, cannot be remembered in an objective way because of his grounded, not elevated experience of the Iraq invasion by American military forces in 2003, when he was just 19. So Mohammed Sami's work, it seems to me, is a working through rather than working over the site of trauma, from early childhood up until his 23rd birthday, when he becomes a refugee in a Swedish refugee camp. This difference between grounded and elevated experience as a source for the artist's work reminds me of an interview with the conceptual artist Liam Gillick when he was confronted with the question of the personal in his work. We are actually in a weird moment where there is a kind of battle going on in art. It's a battle for realism. It's a battle between the story, like the biography and the personal narrative, and on the other hand, an objective view of the world, a way to try and generalize about the world. I'm not sure where I stand. I am somehow a mixture of both those things. When Liam Gillick set up this binary take on the artist in what he names the battle for realism, I thought of the artist Miroslav Balka as the subjective counterpart to Gillick's logocentrism. Miroslav Balka is an artist who transmutes, as a second-generation survivor of the Holocaust, the traumatic kernel of his Polish parents' and grandparents' primary experiences of World War II into his work. In 2007, and also at the Douglas Hyde Gallery, Miroslav Balka spoke about trauma in terms of distance, that it wasn't his trauma, but his family's trauma, which he understandably inherited as a child second-hand. This second-hand trauma, passed on from parent to child and then to artist, is once removed in the minimalist art language of Miroslav Balka's work, or at the very least abstracted and corrupted in its translation in the temporal, conceptual, and emotional gap between child and parent, and what Gillick later describes as The idea is to become an artist. The work is how to become an artist. That's the more accurate way of saying it. Gillick's mid-talk correction here between idea and work in becoming an artist is dramatic. Once again, it speaks of a working through rather than a working over from an elevation. The difference between Israeli ground troops versus American B-2 stealth bombers striking Iran's nuclear site at Fordo on June 22, 2025. Contra the ground perspective, the God perspective is where ideas can be formulated and mind meetings can be held in the clouds of speculation. The battle between those subjective artists invested in the story, as Gillick calls it, like the biography and the personal narrative, Sami and Balka, and on the other hand, an objective view of the world, a way to try and generalize about the world, like Gillick, is what Gillick calls the battle for realism. Gillick's personal claim that he is somehow a mixture of both those things is strange when you look at his work and what he says about his work. Perhaps artists are in two minds when it comes to this battle for realism, realism being something that is about getting closer to the truth, and personal and objective perspectives can be said to be entangled in that battle for realism. Yet in Miroslav Balka's descriptions of this relationship to the traumatic past, the artist seems to want to distance himself from the association, or at least suspend the narrative surrounding his work by abstracting it to an essence of trauma that is less explicit or attached to a particular traumatic event. I get the same sense from Mohammed Sami when he talks about his work, that he has this autobiography that people will use as a foil to interpret and experience his work. But representation is not the work's purpose. The work is not about a young boy sheltered in a flat for 8 years behind MDF shutters because Saddam Hussein said something about lights or movement attracting the surveillance of American bombers, or about Mohammed Sami's forced act of collusion with the Iraqi government when he painted propagandistic murals for the regime so he could be granted exemption from his difficulty with English and maths, or when Mohammed Sami was exiled to Sweden to a refugee camp and tasted his first experience of freedom, walking in a forest, having a girlfriend. No, it's not about this outline of a biography, which press releases have and will continue to hinge the viewer's turnstile of painted experience. What is interesting in all this is Mohammed Sami chose paint as a tool to transmute his past, or as a tool to live after trauma. The artist uses the metaphor of the shadow of painting that followed him after leaving Iraq to Sweden to Belfast to London. He uses this metaphor of the shadow, a shadow being a result of light, not darkness, to make visceral paintings that examine a life continually transmogrified by time and place on the move. The itinerant artist's shadow is a bat flapping beneath a blue sky of eclipses. If the midday sun is the metaphorical and philosophical truth, when shadows peek around the soles of our feet as you pace forward and back in time and space, Mohammed Sami's paintings are night paintings, metaphorical white lies after the sun sets in the west, when truth, as Emily Dickinson put it, dazzles gradually. Mohammed Sami refers to this graduating truth marinated in the shadow soup of painting and the shadow warrens of his memories, a gentle force. Here at Douglas Hyde Gallery, that gentle force manifests in the obfuscating subject matter that we already know is there, somewhere, mined from experience under a war-torn country and in the aftermath of exile, but a subject matter that manifests as something other than what we know, something that resembles but doesn't represent the trauma itself. These are paintings that invoke for the artist and evoke for us the primary scene. When we walk in on our parents having sex but don't know what sex is. Mohammed Sami rejects the dependency on the primacy of drawing or photography as a referent for his paintings. Referring back to Liam Gillick's "The idea is to become an artist," the work is how to become an artist. Drawing and photography could be described as the idea, whereas paint is the work, or the working through the problems of becoming an artist, erased of ideas, of biography, of self. Mohammed Sami's only refuge from the secondary processes of drawing and photography is to return several times a year to the refugee camp in Sweden to experience that primary scene of freedom as a 23-year-old young man and exile. It's interesting that the art historian Ernst Gombrich locates the 23rd year as the coming of age of an artist, a kind of point zero of maturity. What I get from Mohammed Sami talking about painting is that he holds it as something very serious. It's nothing arbitrary or ironic. It holds his memories while withholding the full force of trauma revisited. When I hear him speak about his paintings, resembling rather than representing trauma, I think of the novelist John Fosse, who was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature. Fosse wrote a 2-part novel named Melancholy, which is a kind of fictional possession of the real-life 18th century Norwegian painter Lars Hertevig. Fosse, in his torturous, repetitive descriptions, ruminations, and hallucinations, embodies a painter who was diagnosed as having schizophrenia. Fosse's interjection of Hertevig gives the novelist the poetic license to imagine what lies beyond the traumatic kernel with all its florid images that are removed from realism, but somehow more real in the battle to make sense of them. Mohammed Sami's paintings conjure this uncanny resemblance of a feeling attached to a physical sight, now lost to time and the visual lies of nostalgia and emotional attachment. The painted eclipses that block the entrances and exits to the painter's psychological objects and spaces remind me of what photographer Gregory Crutzen said about being a child and listening in to his father's psychoanalytic sessions with clients in the home basement from the safety, distance, and elevation of the stairs. However, through wall and elevation, Gregory Crutzen could only piece together poetic meaning from the bits of muffled words and broken sentences. And anyway, as a child, he didn't understand most of what was being said. Yet, in adulthood and artisthood, summoned the personal feelings and spatial moods of this event in all of his photography thereafter. It was like when someone said to me, as a father of a young child, "They may not remember the words you shouted at them, but they'll certainly remember how they felt." Even though I love the painted forms and gestures of Brian Maguire's paintings, they are explicit in terms of their colonization of trauma, whereas Mohammed Sami gives us something ambiguous. He uses words like euphemism, allegory, and indexicality to explain the literary and visual forms that exist in his own culture. He has adopted these forms of ambiguity so the message arrives on the surface as paint, the unconscious being left on the skin, not in the basement where Gregory Crutzen's father excavates the traumatic dreams of his client. Painting's battle for realism is in all those ambiguities. If we feel elevated or uncertain in our gaze, in our emotions, in our thinking around painting, it's doing something real. Painting is not representation, its resemblance to reality, as Mohammed Sami puts it, becomes a surprise not just for us, but for the painter working through the primary processes of becoming a painting, becoming a painter. Standing before Mohammed Sami's massive portrait of the Ayatollah Khomeini, our 10-year-old daughter Lucy immediately recognizes the white brushstrokes in the foreground as banners. Behind these flashes of white paint, which could also be read as smartphone flashes from a crowd of concert goers, the hand gesticulating supreme leader of Iran projects into the night with the luminosity and ghostliness of an outdoor cinema. Paint becomes light at this moment of incandescence, but paint also becomes resemblance in the explicit referent of the Ayatollah made more explicit in current news media regarding the Israeli-US conflict with Iran. Haunted by this image coloured in the blue light of our screens, the battle for realism in painting is not always a zero-sum game, if resemblance, not representation, is the desire for a truth slanted.